Welcome to this week's xConnect Northwest, connecting you to the experts. I'm your host, Greg Mills. Today we're joined by Bruce Bjornstad. He's a geologist from Richland, Washington, and here to talk about the Ice Age floods, how they helped shape our region. Before we get going, a reminder, you can join in at home in the conversation simply by connecting with us on Twitter at NWPTV. Use hashtag xConnectNW. On Facebook, search Northwest Public Television, or by email at kwsutv@wsu.edu. Welcome, Bruce. Thanks for joining us today. Great to have you.
Great. Thank you for having me.
So, Bruce, let's start at the beginning, I suppose, for you. What got you into geology? Was it something you were into early on in your education? Did you grab onto it later in college? And how did you get so excited about the world of geology that you now spend so much time in?
Well, I was actually a latecomer. As an undergrad, I took geology, was my major, but I never really got a job doing that. It was more of a hobby and something. I had to declare a major, so I chose geology. I like being outdoors, so geology appealed to me because I could see myself being outside and enjoying nature, and I always enjoyed science as well.
So you got into the geology during college. Now, out of college, what was the look of your path and your journey after that?
Well, after graduating, I ended up doing some teaching for a few years. Mostly middle school, high school age students, teaching science. And it wasn't until in my late 20s I actually realized I wanted to go on and get an advanced degree. So I applied for a master's program up at Eastern Washington University in 1978. And it was there where I got my master's degree, and I really became a committed geologist.
Well, you share your information in a lot of ways, speaking to a lot of people and giving presentations. It certainly is part of what you do now. Let's talk a little bit about what you talk about, and that is if you drive around the diverse landscape that is the state of Washington alone, I bet not necessarily many of us sort of understand how so many of the shapes that we see, the valleys, the way the river valleys look, the way the mountains are around them. Let's talk a little bit about how the floods from a long time ago shaped the way that our landscape looks today.
Well, that's true, yeah. Back in the Ice Age, as recently as 15,000 years ago, we were hit over and over again by these huge cataclysmic Ice Age floods, unlike anything that's ever happened in modern day. You know, there was as much water as all the rivers in the world combined times 10. Huge volumes of water, volumes is equal to twice two of the Great Lakes in the Midwest, all drained out of glacial Lake Missoula as recently as 15,000 years ago. And they made their way down through Spokane and across the Channel Scabland, and eventually here into the Tri-Cities, before they all drained through one little narrow opening at Wallula Gap.
So when we look at what we call the Scabland area, what are we seeing? What's been taken away? You know, let's look at what it looked like before the flood and what it looks like now, or what happened when the flood went through.
Well, to get a good feel for what it looked like before the floods, all you have to do is look east of the Channel Scabland in the area around Eastern Washington in the Palouse country, where all this our rich wheat fields are growing. Those areas are there because the Ice Age floods never carved through that area. But through the Channel Scabland, that area was all covered with hundreds of feet of that Palouse soil that makes up the Palouse region. So before the Ice Age floods, there was a couple hundred feet of this very rich topsoil that was all stripped away during the Ice Age floods. As many as 100 different floods during the last glacial cycle, between about 20 and 15,000 years ago.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, how many floods are we talking about that took place? And you said over 100. I imagine they varied in their severity as well, huh?
Yeah, they did. There's evidence to suggest that the first floods, the earliest floods, were the biggest and largest, and they progressively got smaller over time until about 13 to 15,000 years ago was the last ice age flood. But the earliest ones in the last cycle were about 20 to 30,000 years ago. And then there are previous glacial cycles before the last one, going all the way back to the beginning of the ice age, perhaps as early as 2 million years ago, we had these ice age floods.
So much of that topsoil that you talked about was removed, and it's kind of hard to get my head around, just how big this flood was. What part of the country benefited? Where did all that topsoil wind up?
Well, when the floods came through, they were 800 or 900 feet deep here in the Tri-Cities, and as they backed up, as the waters backed up behind Willula Gap, the water reversed the flow of the Walla Walla and the Yakima rivers. So the Walla Walla and the Yakima valleys today have hundreds of feet of rich soil that was stripped off the Palouse region and redeposited down into these valleys, and that's why they're so rich agriculturally today.
Yes, that makes sense. That makes sense. Let's talk about the glacial cycle as well. Can you explain that so we can understand just what we're talking about time-wise and what you'd see during that cycle?
Sure. During the Ice Age, it wasn't a continuous glaciation during the Ice Age. The Ice Age, we know, started about 2.5 million years ago during some changes going on with the Earth or its orbit around the Sun changed such that it initiated this Ice Age. But during the Ice Age, there were perhaps at least 100 or at least 10 cycles in the last million years, lasting 100,000 years each, where we had 50,000 glacial conditions, separated by 50,000 years of interglacial conditions like we have today. So we may only be in an interglacial period right now, and we expect perhaps as soon as 35,000 years from now, we could go into another ice age if we continue on that same cycle that's been going on for at least 1 million years.
So we're not technically in an ice age right now, but we're in one of these intermediary cycles, huh?
Right. But and sometime in the future, we could go back into that same cycle of glaciation.
So how long did it take these floods from where they started to make it all the way to the ocean and kind of finish out and leave us with the landscape stripped away the way it was?
Okay, well, geologists and hydrologists have estimated it took only 3 days for all the water from glacial Lake Missoula to drain out. But it took up to 3 weeks for all that water to make its way out to the Pacific Ocean, which was 600 miles away. And the reason it took longer for the water to drain out is it kept hitting these constrictions, these pinch points, where the flow of water going into the pinch point was greater than the pinch point could actually let go through. Willula Gap is a good example. Twice as much water was going into the Willula Gap than could go through, creating a huge lake 900 feet deep over the Tri-Cities. So it took 3 weeks for all that water to drain out through Willula Gap, down through the Columbia Gorge, and then out to the Pacific Ocean.
I imagine that some of the lakes that we know today were just formed by the fact that the Earth was torn away and that so much water was left in some of these pockets. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that there's good evidence that these lakes existed because they left behind thick deposits of these flood sediments that were stripped off the Palouse and redeposited down here in the basins.
What about evidence of human beings during the time of these glacial floods?
Well, there's no direct evidence that man was ever here. There is evidence for man being present in Central Oregon as recently as about 16,000 calendar years ago, which is about the same time as the last floods. There's evidence for man down there in Central Oregon. There's no direct evidence up here associated with the floods because the floods probably eroded away a lot of the evidence for man being here, or it just buried the deposits so that we can't see them today. But over time, I wouldn't be surprised in the next few dozen years if man uncovered evidence for human remains or artifacts of humans in these flood deposits. We just haven't found them yet. And we have Native American stories. Here in the Tri-Cities area, we have Rattlesnake Mountain. The Native Americans' name for that mountain is called Lalik, which translated means land above the waters. And there's no water around, or hardly any water around today. So perhaps there were humans here back during the Ice Age. That's been the evidence being handed down from generation to generation through the Native Americans.
So during an ice age, let's talk about what that would really be like. I think maybe some of it conjures up something in your mind where you're thinking just everything is completely covered in ice everywhere. But are we just talking about a number of degrees different in temperature geologically, or is it something more catastrophic than that?
Well, the ice sheet that created the ice dam for the Ice Age floods was up in the Pend Oreille Basin in northern Idaho. And we had these fingers of ice that came down from Canada in the Cordilleran ice sheet that came down into this area. So the climate was quite a bit different back then. It was much cold. Well, it may have only been a few degrees centigrade colder, but this area of eastern Washington was probably mostly a tundra during that time. So the climate shifted. Warmer climates were to the south of us, but up here in this area, it could have been a tundra type environment in front of the ice sheet.
Yeah. Are we ever going to see floods like that again?
Are we going to ever see Ice Age floods again?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, as I said earlier, if we continue in the same cycle that we've been in for the last million years, we could enter another glacial cycle within about 35,000 years from now. And so I'm confident that, despite global warming and the perturbations man has on the climate today, I don't know how long those will exist, but 35,000 years from now, we could easily go back and repeat that cycle of glaciation and create new Ice Age floods.
Well, Bruce, thank you so much for joining us today. It's an interesting topic. I know people will have an opportunity, perhaps, to be able to see you in one of your talks, and they can get a hold of you and see your work on your website as well, right?
Exactly. Thank you.
Yeah, and your website is, tell me again?
My website is www.brucebjornstad.com.
All right. Thanks again for being with us. Hope you at home enjoyed the show with us as well. It was great having Bruce along. Remember, you can stay connected with us all week. You can tweet us, link with us on Facebook, add us to your circle on Google+, or email us at kwsutv@wsu.edu. And send us your show ideas. If you missed any part of today's show, don't worry, it'll be available online at nwptv.org. Next time on xConnect Northwest, we're going to be talking about the Washington-Idaho Symphony with WSU music composer Dr. Ryan Hare. Dr. Hare will join us live from our Pullman studios, and if you have questions for him, feel free to connect with us online. I'm Greg Mills. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time on air and online.